The candles went out one by one, and nobody in that ballroom understood why until it was too late to stop it. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the center of 100 watching eyes, her hand still hovering in the air where the Duke of Marlow had offered his own a moment before. She had not taken it. She had said no, out loud, in front of everyone. The orchestra faltered mid-note. A violin string seemed to catch in someone's throat. "No, Your Grace," she said again, quieter this time, though the whole room had already heard it the first time. "I will not dance with you tonight." Alistair Kingsley, Duke of Marlow, did not flinch. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that made other men nervous in rooms they thought they controlled. He lowered his hand slowly, as though he were setting something down rather than being refused. Behind Eleanor, her mother's fan snapped shut with a sound like a gunshot. "Eleanor!" her mother hissed. "Have you lost your senses?" Eleanor had not lost her senses. She had never had them more firmly in place. She knew exactly what refusing a duke in the middle of the season's largest ball would cost her family's name. She knew the whispers would follow her out the door and into every drawing room in London by morning. She knew all of it, and she still could not take his hand, because 3 nights ago she had watched a man die in an alley behind a counting house on Fenwick Street, and the man who had put the knife in him was standing not 30 feet away, smiling at her like they shared a secret. Edmund Vale raised his glass to her from across the room. She looked away first. The Duke had not moved. "You refuse me," he said, in front of 400 people. "I refuse you," Eleanor said, "because I choose to." A ripple of scandalized laughter moved through the nearest guests, quickly swallowed. Nobody laughed at a duke. Nobody refused one either. Not like this. Not with her chin lifted and her voice steady and her eyes daring him to make it worse. He made it worse. He turned from her and lifted one hand, and the room's steward, a man in the Marlow livery who had been standing near the doors all evening as if waiting for exactly this moment, stepped forward and struck a small brass bell 3 times. The musicians stopped entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Duke said, and his voice carried without him raising it, the way voices do when a man has never once needed to shout to be obeyed. "I thank you for your evening. The ball is concluded." For a moment, nobody moved, certain they had misheard him. "You may collect your wraps in the hall," he continued. "My staff will see you to your carriages." Eleanor's mother made a small, strangled sound. Lord Ashworth, standing near the punch table with a glass he had not touched, went the color of old parchment. "Your Grace," someone began, one of the older matrons, scandalized past speech, "surely you cannot mean—" "I mean it entirely," the Duke said, and something in his tone closed the subject the way a door closes a room. It took 11 minutes to empty a ballroom of 400 people. Eleanor counted every one of them, because counting was easier than looking at the man now walking toward her across the abandoned floor, his footsteps the only sound left in a room built for music. Edmund Vale left last of all. He paused at the doorway, glanced back at her, and touched 2 fingers to his temple in a mock salute that made her stomach fold in on itself. Then the doors closed, and it was only Eleanor, and the Duke, and 400 empty chairs, and candlelight throwing long shadows across a floor, polished for dancing, that no one was doing anymore. "You have gone quite mad," Eleanor said, because it was easier to say that than to say anything true. Possibly. The Duke stopped 6 feet from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough that she did not feel cornered, not yet. "Tell me why you refused me." "I don't owe you a reason." "No," he agreed, "you don't, but you'll give me one anyway, because you're not the sort of woman who says nothing when she has something to say. I've watched you all season, Lady Ashworth. You refused Lord Pemberton in March. You refused Sir Aldous in April. You have refused every man who has asked you to dance this year except one." Eleanor's throat went tight. "I don't know what you mean." "Edmund Vale," the Duke said, and the name landed in the empty room like a stone dropped into still water. "You danced with him in February. You have not danced with anyone since." She said nothing. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, had curled into fists so tight her nails bit half-moons into her palms. "Now you have no choice, my lady," the Duke said quietly. "There is no one left to see you refuse me, no one left to whisper. It is only the two of us in this room, and I am asking you again, why won't you dance with me?" The candles guttered in a draft from somewhere. Eleanor watched the shadows lengthen and shorten across the Duke's face, and she thought of the alley behind Fenwick Street, and the sound a man makes when he stops breathing, and Edmund Vale's calm hands wiping something dark onto a handkerchief before he saw her standing in the shadow of a doorway and smiled. "Because if I dance with you," she said finally, "he will know I've chosen a side, and I have seen what he does to people who choose the wrong one." The Duke went very still. "Who," he said, "is he?" Eleanor looked at the closed doors, half expecting them to open, half expecting Vale's face to appear in the gap. Watching, always watching. "You already know," she said. "You cleared the room because you already suspected. That's why you did all this. Not for a dance." Something moved behind the Duke's eyes, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. "I cleared the room," he said, "because 3 weeks ago my own sister told me she had seen something terrible, and 2 days after she told me, she was found at the bottom of the servants' stair with a broken neck, and no one in this city willing to call it anything but an accident." The ballroom held its breath around them. "Her name was Charlotte," the Duke said, "and I think Edmund Vale killed her." Eleanor's knees went weak enough that she had to reach for the back of a chair. She had spent 3 nights convincing herself that what she'd seen in that alley was an isolated horror, a single unbearable thing she could carry alone if she simply never spoke of it. She had not let herself imagine that it was one thread in something larger, something that had already reached into a Duke's own household and taken a sister from him. "I saw him," she whispered, 3 nights ago, Fenwick Street. He killed a man there, and he saw me standing in the doorway when he did it." The Duke crossed the last 6 feet between them in 2 strides and caught her elbow before her legs entirely gave way. "Did he see your face?" "Yes." "Did he speak to you?" "No. He only smiled, and tonight he raised his glass to me from across the room, as if it were a joke between us. As if I would never tell anyone, because who would believe me over a man his family's fortune protects?" "I would believe you," the Duke said. "I would believe you before I believed any other soul in this city." Eleanor looked up at him, and for the first time all evening, she let herself really look, not at a duke, not at a title, not at 400 whispers waiting outside those closed doors, but at a man whose sister had died and who had built an entire empty ballroom around the two of them just to ask her a question honestly. "Why did you really clear the room?" she asked. "Because Vale was watching you all night the way a man watches something he owns," the Duke said. "And I did not intend to let him watch you refuse me and think it meant you were still afraid of him alone in a crowd. I wanted him to see the room empty. I wanted him to understand that whatever happens next, he does not have the only set of eyes in London." Outside, faintly, through the tall windows, Eleanor heard the last of the carriages rolling away over cobblestones, carrying home 400 people who would spend the next week retelling a story none of them understood at all. A duke, a refused dance, an emptied ballroom, a woman left standing alone with him in candlelight. None of them would ever guess that inside that room a war had just begun, and neither Eleanor nor the Duke standing across from her had the first idea yet how far Edmund Vale was willing to go to win it. "There is a great deal you don't know," Eleanor said quietly, "about what I saw, about what he does. If I tell you, you cannot simply challenge him to satisfaction and think it ends there. Men like Vale do not fight fair, and they do not fight alone." "Then don't tell me tonight," the Duke said. "Tell me somewhere he cannot possibly be listening. Tell me tomorrow, in daylight, where 400 people cannot turn it into gossip before you've finished a sentence." Eleanor let out a breath she felt she had been holding since Fenwick Street. "You would wait until tomorrow, after all this?" "I have waited 3 weeks to find one person in London willing to say my sister's death was murder and not misfortune," the Duke said. I can wait one more night to hear it properly." He extended his hand again, the same hand she had refused in front of the whole of society not 20 minutes earlier. This time there was no orchestra, no watching crowd, no reputation hanging in the balance. There was only an empty ballroom, guttering candles, and a question that had nothing to do with dancing at all. Eleanor looked at his hand for a long moment. Then, finally, she took it. Neither of them noticed the shadow that slipped away from the terrace door outside, nor the soft, unhurried footsteps that carried Edmund Vale back toward his waiting carriage with the same calm smile he always wore, even now, even having heard every single word. Morning came to London gray and reluctant, the kind of light that made everything look like it was holding its breath. Eleanor had not slept. She had spent the hours turning Vale's smile over in her mind, the raised glass, the 2 fingers touched to his temple, and wondering how a man could look so pleased with himself while carrying a secret that should have crushed him. She dressed plainly and told her mother she was calling on a friend from school, a lie so ordinary her mother didn't even look up from her correspondence to question it. The truth was a closed carriage waiting 2 streets away, sent by the Duke, with instructions written in a hand so careful it looked like each letter had been considered twice. The house he chose was not his own. It belonged, the footman explained, to a physician who owed the Marlowe family a debt of gratitude and asked no questions about who used his study on a quiet Tuesday morning. Eleanor found that detail more unsettling than reassuring. A man who planned this carefully for a simple conversation was a man who understood exactly how dangerous the conversation was. The Duke was already there when she arrived, standing at a window that looked out over a garden gone slightly wild at the edges. He turned when she entered and did not offer any of the pleasantries she expected. He simply said, "Thank you for coming," and gestured to a chair near the cold hearth. "I nearly didn't," Eleanor admitted, sitting. "I spent half the night convinced I was making a terrible mistake, trusting anyone with this." "And the other half?" "The other half I spent thinking about your sister, and how frightened she must have been, telling you what she saw, and then being alone with it anyway, when it mattered most." Something crossed the Duke's face, quick and raw, gone as fast as it came. He sat across from her, his hands loosely clasped, and for a moment he looked less like a duke and more like a brother who had failed at the one thing that mattered. Charlotte was 17, he said. She had a way of noticing things no one else bothered to notice. Servants adored her because she remembered their birthdays and their children's names. She noticed a stranger visiting our steward late at night, twice in 1 month, and instead of telling me right away, she watched. She always watched a thing a little longer than she should have, trying to understand it fully before she spoke. What did she see? Ledgers, the Duke said. Our steward, a man named Harlan Priest, kept 2 sets of books for the estate. Charlotte found the second set by accident, looking for a ribbon she'd misplaced in his office. She didn't understand what she was looking at, not fully, but she understood enough to know it frightened her. Money moving in and out that had no explanation. Payments to men whose names she didn't recognize. She told me 3 days before she died. And you believe Vale is connected to this? Priest works closely with a shipping concern that imports goods from the continent, the Duke said. Officially, wine and lace and porcelain. Unofficially, I believe something else moves through those same crates, and I believe Edmund Vale profits from it more than any single gentleman in London ought to be able to explain. Eleanor's hands had gone cold in her lap. The man I saw him kill on Fenwick Street. He was arguing with Vale before it happened. I only heard fragments through the wall of the alley, something about a shipment gone missing, about money owed, about a name I didn't recognize. Cabrera, I think, or something close to it. The Duke went very still. Say that again. Cabrera, I couldn't be certain. Does it mean something to you? It means everything, he said, and for the first time that morning, something like hope moved through his voice. Cabrera is the name on 3 of the false entries in Priest's second ledger. A supplier, ostensibly. Charlotte copied a page of it into her own hand before she died, hidden in the lining of her sewing box, where I found it a week after we buried her." He rose and crossed to a writing desk in the corner, retrieving a small folded paper from a locked drawer, and brought it to her. Eleanor unfolded it carefully, a column of numbers, dates, and beside them, in a girl's careful, rounded hand, the name Cabrera appeared 3 times, each beside a sum of money large enough to buy a modest house outright. "This is real," Eleanor whispered. "This is proof." "It is a fragment of proof," the Duke corrected gently. "Enough to raise a question. Not enough to hang a man, and certainly not enough to hang a man as well protected as Edmund Vale. His family holds 3 seats in Parliament through influence alone. A duke's suspicion and a dead girl's handwriting will not be enough against that kind of shelter." "Then what will be enough?" "You," the Duke said. "You saw him commit murder with your own eyes. You heard him speak Cabrera's name aloud in connection with money owed. If we can find the man Vale killed and learn who he was, why he was owed money, what he knew, we may be able to draw a line from that alley straight to priests' ledgers and straight to Vale's own hand." Eleanor felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, not from fear this time, but from the sudden, dizzying shape of what he was asking. "You want me to help you build a case against him?" "I want your help, yes, but I will not pretend to you that it is without danger. He already knows your face. If he learns you are working against him rather than simply frightened into silence, I cannot promise what he will do." "He raised his glass to me last night," Eleanor said quietly, "as if we shared something pleasant between us. I think he believes fear alone will keep me quiet. I think that is the only reason I am still safely sitting in this room and not lying somewhere the way that poor man on Fenwick Street is lying." "Then let him keep believing it," the Duke said. "Let him believe you are simply a frightened girl who will never speak. Meanwhile, we find out who the dead man was, and we find Cabrera, and we build something no influence in Parliament can talk its way around." Eleanor considered this for a long moment, watching the garden outside the window sway in a wind that smelled faintly of rain. "Where do we begin?" "With the dead man," the Duke said. "A body found on Fenwick Street 3 nights ago will have been reported somewhere, even if quietly. My man of business has connections at the magistrate's office. We will learn his name today if we can." True to his word, by early afternoon a note arrived at the physician's house, carried by a boy who did not wait for a reply. The Duke read it twice before passing it to Eleanor. The dead man's name was Gerald Finch, a clerk who had once worked for a shipping agent near the docks, before losing his position under circumstances the note described only as irregular. He had no family listed, no known address beyond a boarding house that had, according to the magistrate's clerk, already been quietly cleared of his belongings by persons unknown before the local constable ever arrived to investigate. "Someone got there first," Eleanor said. "Someone always gets there first, when Vale is involved," the Duke replied grimly. "But a man does not simply vanish without leaving some trace of the life he led. A boarding house has a landlady. A landlady has memory of visitors, of habits, of who a man spoke to before he disappeared. You want to go to the boarding house. I want you to stay far from it," the Duke said, more firmly than she expected. "If Vale is watching anyone in this affair, it will be you. I will send someone discreet, someone whose face means nothing to anyone watching, and we will learn what there is to learn." Eleanor felt something bristle in her at the thought of being set carefully aside like a delicate object, too fragile for the work, now that the work had truly begun. "I found this thread first, Your Grace. I stood in that alley. I have as much right to follow it as you do." "I do not doubt your right," the Duke said. "I doubt only the wisdom of putting your face anywhere Vale's people might see it twice in 1 week. Let me be the one who is seen. Let you be the one no one suspects at all." It was, Eleanor had to admit, a reasonable argument, however little she enjoyed hearing it. She sat with it a long moment, turning the compromise over the way she had turned Vale's smile over the night before, testing it for weaknesses. "Very well," she said finally, "but you will tell me everything you learn, the moment you learn it. I will not be managed, Your Grace, even kindly." Something that might have been the beginning of a real smile touched the corner of the Duke's mouth. I would not dream of managing you, Lady Ashworth. I cleared an entire ballroom last night rather than let you be managed by anyone, including myself. You cleared it to ask me a question. I cleared it, he said, because I could not bear to watch Vale smile at you across a room and do nothing at all. Whatever else comes of this, understand that part clearly. It was never only about the dance. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, this careful, deliberate man who had upended an entire evening society gathering rather than let a murderer enjoy his small cruelty in peace, and she felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. Then let us find out what Gerald Finch knew, she said, before whoever cleared out his room decides there is anyone else worth silencing. The Duke nodded once, gathered the folded ledger page and returned it carefully to its locked drawer, and for a moment, in that quiet borrowed study with the garden rustling outside, it felt almost possible to believe that two people determined enough might actually stand a chance against a man who had already killed twice and smiled while doing it. Neither of them yet knew that Edmund Vale had already learned of their morning meeting, carried to him within the hour by a maid in the physician's own household who owed her position, quietly and entirely, to Vale's coin. Edmund Vale arrived at the Ashworth townhouse the following afternoon, carrying a small bouquet of white roses, and a smile so pleasant it made Eleanor's skin crawl the moment she saw him through the drawing-room window. "Lord Vale to see you, my lady," the footman announced, and Eleanor had exactly the length of time it took to cross the hall to compose her face into something that would not betray her. "Lady Ashworth," Vale said, bowing over her hand with perfect courtesy. "I hoped you might forgive an uninvited caller. I found myself thinking of you after last evening's rather unusual entertainment." "It was an unusual evening," Eleanor agreed, taking the roses because refusing them would have said too much. "The Duke has strange notions of hospitality." "Strange indeed." Vale settled into a chair without waiting to be asked, a small liberty that told her exactly how safe he believed himself to be in her presence. "Though I confess, I found it rather touching. A man clearing an entire ballroom simply to press his suit with one reluctant lady. Almost romantic, if one didn't know better." "Didn't know better about what, my lord?" Vale's smile did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened, like a blade catching light. "About how very inconvenient it can be, Lady Ashworth, for a young woman to develop opinions about things that do not concern her. I have always admired your father. Lord Ashworth is a man of considerable debts and considerable pride, an unfortunate combination in uncertain times. It would grieve me terribly to see either the debts or the pride cause him difficulty." The threat sat between them in the quiet drawing-room, dressed in flowers and pleasantries, unmistakable all the same. "My father's affairs are his own," Eleanor said carefully. "Of course they are. I only mention it because family matters so much, don't you think? A daughter's silence can protect a father's fortune more thoroughly than any investment, and a daughter's chatter, however innocent, however well-intentioned, can undo years of careful arrangement in a single unfortunate conversation." He rose, smoothing his coat. "I do hope you'll remember that, should you ever find yourself tempted toward unfortunate conversations." "I have no idea what you mean, my lord." "No," Vale agreed pleasantly. "I'm certain you don't." He bowed again, unhurried, entirely at ease. "Lady Barrington holds a small gathering Thursday next. I do hope to see you there. And the Duke, should his notions of hospitality permit him to attend a ball that remains, this time, fully populated." He left as calmly as he had arrived, and Eleanor stood alone in the drawing-room with a bouquet of roses she suddenly wanted very much to throw into the fire. She wrote to the Duke that same hour, in careful, unremarkable language that would mean nothing to anyone but him, and within the day his answer arrived. They would speak that evening, at the same borrowed house, and he had news of his own. The physician's study looked exactly as it had 2 days before, save that the Duke stood at the window with a folded letter in hand, instead of watching the garden. "Vale visited you," he said, before she had even fully entered the room. "I had word within the hour." He is watching your house as closely as I feared he might. He threatened my father's debts, Eleanor said. Nothing so crude as a direct threat against my life. Only the suggestion that my silence protects my family, and my speech destroys it. It was, in its way, more frightening than if he had simply threatened me outright. The Duke's jaw tightened. Men like Vale prefer threats dressed in courtesy. It allows them to claim, later, that nothing improper was ever said at all. He crossed to a small table and laid the folded letter upon it. My man found the boarding house landlady willing to speak, for a modest sum and the promise of discretion. Gerald Finch received one regular visitor in his final month, a foreign gentleman the landlady knew only as Cabrera, who came twice weekly and always left arguing under his breath. Arguing about what? Money owed, according to the landlady, though she claimed not to understand the particulars. But Finch left behind one item the landlady had kept, rather than discarded, thinking it might fetch a price from whoever came asking after his affairs eventually. The Duke unfolded the letter to reveal, tucked within it, a small scrap of paper covered in cramped, hurried handwriting. A note, sewn into the lining of a coat Finch left behind unworn. My man found it only because the landlady mentioned the coat felt oddly heavy for its make. Eleanor took the scrap carefully and read it twice before the meaning settled fully into her chest. It was addressed to no one by name, written as though Finch had intended it as insurance rather than correspondence, a confession scrawled in the hand of a frightened man who suspected his own days were numbered. It named Harlan Priest as the keeper of false accounts. It named a shipping concern moving goods that were not wine, or lace, or porcelain at all, but something the note called simply cargo, in a tone that made the word feel far darker than its letters suggested. And at the bottom, in ink pressed so hard it had nearly torn the paper, it named Edmund Vale as the man who gave the orders and kept the profits. "This is enough," Eleanor breathed. "Surely this is enough." It is a dead man's private note, written by a man with every reason to fear for his life, and no way now to swear to its truth before a magistrate, the Duke said, though she heard the current of hope beneath his caution. It will not convict him alone, but paired with Charlotte's ledger page and paired with your own eyewitness account of the murder itself, it begins to form a case even influence cannot simply talk away. Then what do we do with it? "We need one more piece," the Duke said. "The magistrate who would hear such a case, a man named Alderman Whitfield, is honest but cautious. He will not move against a peer of Vale's standing on the word of a dead clerk's note and a young lady's testimony alone, not without something that ties Vale's own hand directly to the cargo itself. If we can find where the goods are stored, or better yet find Cabrera and persuade him to speak, we will have enough to force Whitfield's hand, regardless of whose family sits in Parliament. And Vale has invited us both to Lady Barrington's gathering on Thursday," Eleanor said slowly, the shape of an idea beginning to form. "He wishes to see whether I have chosen to remain silent, or whether I have chosen a side. What if we let him believe exactly what he expects to see, while we use the very same evening to learn what we still need?" The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like admiration moving across his careful expression. "Go on." "Vale collects admiration the way other men collect snuff boxes," Eleanor said. "He will want to see me humbled, uncertain, perhaps even danced with by no one at all, so he may believe his warning succeeded. Let him see that. Let him believe I am too frightened to so much as look at you across a room. Meanwhile, someone unremarkable, someone whose face means nothing to him, might slip away during the evening and search wherever his shipping concern keeps its ledgers close at hand. Lady Barrington's own husband sits on the board of the very shipping company Vale uses, does he not?" "He does," the Duke said slowly. "I had not considered using the gathering itself as cover." "Then consider it now," Eleanor said. "Let Vale watch me refuse you again, publicly, convincingly. Let him believe his threat worked entirely. And while he enjoys that small triumph, let your discreet man find whatever ledger or manifest connects Barrington's shipping concern to Cabrera's name." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again his voice had gone low and careful. "You would stand in that room and refuse me again, knowing what it truly means this time, purely to give us the cover we need." "I would do considerably more than that," Eleanor said, "to see that man answer for what he did to your sister, and to the man I watched him kill, and to whatever poor soul comes next if we do nothing at all." Thursday arrived with a chill that promised early frost, and Lady Barrington's townhouse glittered with candlelight and noise in a way that felt, to Eleanor, almost obscene given what she knew now moved beneath the surface of polite society. Vale found her within the first quarter hour, his smile as pleasant and as sharp as ever. "Lady Ashworth, how lovely you look this evening. I do hope you've given thought to our conversation." "I have thought of little else, my lord," Eleanor said, which was, in its way, entirely true. Across the room, the Duke approached at precisely the moment they had agreed upon, bowing with perfect correctness and extending his hand exactly as he had 2 nights before, in an empty ballroom that now felt like it belonged to another lifetime entirely. "Lady Ashworth, might I have this dance?" Eleanor felt Vale's attention sharpen beside her, like a held breath, waiting to see which way the wind would turn. "I think not, Your Grace," she said, and made herself look faintly, convincingly troubled as she said it, as though the refusal cost her something precious. "I find I have very little taste for dancing this season." Something in the Duke's eyes flickered, quick and private, an acknowledgement that passed between them and no one else in the crowded room. He bowed again, accepting the refusal with outward grace, and withdrew toward the card-room without a backward glance, exactly as they had planned. Vale's smile widened, satisfied and pleased with himself, in a way that made Eleanor's stomach turn even as she kept her own expression carefully composed. "Wise girl," he murmured, close enough that only she could hear it. "Fortune favors those who understand where true power lies." "I have always tried to understand exactly where power lies, my lord," Eleanor said, and let him hear in it whatever comfort he wished to hear, while beneath her calm exterior, her mind followed the Duke's discreet man through the house in her imagination, praying he moved quickly and quietly, and found whatever truth waited in Lord Barrington's private study before the evening ended and the careful performance she and the Duke had built together came apart at the seams. The Duke's man was called Ellis, a quiet former soldier who had served under the Duke's late father and asked no questions he wasn't given answers to. He moved through Lord Barrington's townhouse that evening the way a man moves who has learned never to look like he is going anywhere in particular, drifting past footmen and half-open doors until he found the small study tucked behind the library, exactly where the Duke's earlier inquiries had suggested it might be. The desk was locked, but the lock was old, and Ellis's hands were patient. Inside, beneath a stack of ordinary correspondence, he found a ledger bound in plain leather, unremarkable in every way except for the columns of figures inside, and beside 3 separate entries, written in a clerk's careful hand, the name Cabrera appeared again, this time beside an address near the river, a warehouse listed simply as storage for imported goods. Ellis copied the address quickly onto a scrap of paper, returned the ledger exactly as he had found it, and had just eased the study door shut behind him when a voice in the corridor nearly stopped his heart. "You there. This wing is not open to guests." It was not Vale. It was Lord Barrington himself, portly and irritated, clearly displeased to find a stranger wandering near his private study during his own ball. Ellis, trained for exactly this sort of moment, bowed with the easy apology of a servant who had simply lost his way looking for a retiring room, and Barrington, more concerned with his evening's wine than with chasing down a lost footman, waved him off toward the main hall with an irritated grunt. It was close, closer than Ellis liked, and closer than he would admit to the Duke until much later, when the danger of the evening had fully passed and there was room again for honesty about how narrow the escape had truly been. He found the Duke in the card-room precisely where they had agreed, and passed him the scrap of paper in a handshake so practiced it looked like nothing more than 2 gentlemen exchanging pleasantries. The Duke read the address once, memorized it, and burned the scrap in a candle flame before anyone else could glance at it. Across the ballroom, Eleanor felt rather than saw the exchange complete itself, a small loosening in her chest that came from knowing, at last, that the evening's careful performance had not been wasted. She excused herself from Vale's company as gracefully as she could manage, claiming a headache that was not entirely feigned, and made her way toward the terrace doors for a breath of air that did not taste of candle smoke and threat. She did not notice, until it was nearly too late, that Vale had followed her. Lady Ashworth, his voice, close behind her on the darkened terrace, made every hair on her arms rise at once. "You seem in rather good spirits for a woman claiming a headache." Eleanor turned, arranging her face into something as neutral as she could manage on short notice. "I find fresh air does wonders, my lord. I did not mean to alarm you." "You didn't alarm me." Vale stepped closer, and in the dim light from the ballroom windows, his pleasant expression had gone thin and cold, in a way she had not seen since that night on Fenwick Street. "But I confess I find myself curious. The Duke's man, the one who wandered rather too near Lord Barrington's study this evening, seemed remarkably interested in a room that holds nothing of interest to anyone but Barrington's own accounts." Eleanor's heart dropped like a stone through still water, but she kept her voice even through sheer force of will. "I'm afraid I have no notion what you mean, my lord." "No," Vale said softly. "I imagine you don't." He studied her for a long, silent moment, and Eleanor understood, in that instant, that whatever careful performance she and the Duke had built together that evening had not been quite careful enough. "I did warn you, Lady Ashworth, about unfortunate conversations. I wonder now whether I ought to have been clearer about the cost of unfortunate curiosity as well." "Is that a threat, my lord?" "It is a kindness," Vale said, "from a man who would genuinely prefer not to see harm come to a young lady he has admired for quite some time. But kindness, like patience, has its limits. Give my regards to your father. I do hope his health remains sound. Debts have a way of becoming so very burdensome when a man's constitution weakens under the strain of them." He left her standing alone on the terrace, the cold air suddenly doing nothing at all to steady the trembling that had taken hold of her hands. She found the Duke within minutes, drawing him away from the card-room with a look that needed no words at all to convey its urgency, and together they retreated to a small unused parlor where she told him everything Vale had said. "He suspects Ellis," the Duke said grimly, once she had finished. "Which means he suspects us both. We have very little time before he moves to protect whatever is stored at that warehouse, or worse, moves against your family directly to silence you, before you can do him any further harm." "He threatened my father's health," Eleanor said, her voice tight with a fear she had been holding back all evening. "Not his fortune this time. His health. That is not the language of a man playing at intimidation any longer." The Duke's expression hardened into something Eleanor had not yet seen from him. Cold and immovable, the look of a man who had already lost one person he loved to this same threat, and would not lose another. "Then we move tonight. Not tomorrow, not once we've slept and reconsidered our courage in the daylight. Tonight, before Vale has time to clear that warehouse the same way he cleared Finch's boarding-house room." "You mean to go to the river yourself?" "I mean for us to go together," the Duke said, "though I expect you'll tell me it's unwise for you to come, and I expect I'll agree with you entirely, and I expect neither of us will listen to that good sense for a single moment, because we have already learned this evening what happens when we let Vale act while we wait patiently for daylight to make things safer." Eleanor almost laughed, despite everything, at how precisely he had read her intentions. "Then let us not wait for daylight." They left Lady Barrington's ball separately, 20 minutes apart, exactly as caution demanded, and met at a corner, 3 streets away, where the Duke's own carriage waited, its lamps unlit, its driver, a man as trusted and as quiet as Ellis himself. The warehouse stood at the address Ellis had copied, a squat brick building crouched near the black water of the river, its windows dark, its door secured with a chain and lock that looked far too new for a building otherwise coated in years of grime and neglect. "Someone maintains this lock carefully," the Duke murmured, examining it by the light of a shuttered lantern. which tells us plainly enough that whatever is inside matters a great deal to someone. Ellis, who had followed them at a discreet distance from the ball, produced from his coat the same patient tools that had opened Barrington's desk drawer, and within minutes the lock gave way with a soft, reluctant click. Inside, the warehouse smelled of salt water and tar and something else beneath it, sharp and unfamiliar, that made Eleanor's stomach turn before her mind had fully identified what it was. Crates lined the walls, stacked 3 and 4 high, stamped with the marks of ordinary imported goods, wine and lace and porcelain, exactly as the Duke had described. "Open one," the Duke said quietly to Ellis, and the soldier set to work on the nearest crate, with a crowbar produced from somewhere within his coat. The lid came free with a groan of old wood, and inside, nestled among straw packing meant to protect fine porcelain, lay something else entirely. Not china, not lace, rows of small, tightly wrapped packages that the Duke lifted carefully into the lantern light and unwrapped just enough to reveal a dark, resinous substance Eleanor did not recognize, but whose danger she understood instantly from the sudden grim set of the Duke's jaw. "Opium," the Duke said quietly, "smuggled past customs beneath legitimate cargo, sold at enormous profit to men who ruin themselves and their families for it. This is what Charlotte found the shadow of in Priest's ledgers. This is what Gerald Finch was killed protecting a secret about, and this is what Cabrera supplies from wherever these crates first crossed the water." Eleanor stared at the packages, feeling the full weight of what they had uncovered settle over her like a physical thing. This is enough, surely. This is proof no influence in Parliament could argue away. "It is proof," the Duke agreed, "if we can get it before Alderman Whitfield, before Vale learns we have found it, and empties this warehouse the way he emptied everything else that has ever threatened him." A sound from the doorway behind them turned every head in the room at once. "I rather think," Edmund Vale said pleasantly, stepping into the lantern light with 2 large men flanking him in the shadows behind, "that you have found precisely what you were never meant to find, Your Grace. Which leaves me the rather tedious task of deciding what to do with all 3 of you, now that you have." The lantern light threw long shadows across the crates between them, and for a long, silent moment nobody moved at all. Eleanor felt her own heartbeat in her throat, counting the 2 men behind Vale, counting the distance to the door, counting every possible way this moment could end, and finding none of them comforting. "You've made a considerable error, Vale," the Duke said, and his voice carried none of the fear Eleanor felt gripping her own chest. "3 people know we came here tonight. My household staff expects my return within the hour. Should I fail to appear, they have instructions already written and sealed, addressed to Alderman Whitfield himself, naming this address and everything I have suspected of you since my sister's death." It was a lie, Eleanor knew, spoken smoothly enough that even she nearly believed it. No such letter existed. But Vale's confidence flickered, just slightly, just long enough for Eleanor to understand that fear worked both directions, even on a man who had spent months believing himself untouchable. "A convenient claim," Vale said, "though not, I think, one I can simply take on faith." "Then take it on the faith of a Duke's word," the Duke replied, "which is carried rather further in this city than a shipping merchant's, however well connected his family seats in Parliament." Vale's jaw tightened. Whatever else he was not a fool, and a fool's mistake now, with a Duke's disappearance to answer for, could unravel everything he had built far faster than one troublesome witness ever could. "What is it you imagine happens now, Your Grace? You cannot simply walk out of this warehouse with crates of evidence and expect me to wish you a pleasant evening." "I expect considerably less drama than you imagine," the Duke said. "I expect you to consider, carefully, what happens to a man of your standing when a murder charge, a smuggling charge, and the sworn testimony of an eyewitness all arrive on a magistrate's desk within the same week. I expect you to consider what happens to that same man when he compounds his troubles with the disappearance of a duke and a lady of good family on top of everything else. Whitfield may hesitate before a peer's reputation. He will not hesitate before 3 bodies and a duke's own sealed letter naming you as their killer." Silence stretched through the warehouse, broken only by the soft lap of the river against the pilings outside. It was Ellis, in the end, who moved first, not toward Vale, but toward the lantern, sweeping it from its hook and hurling the light itself, extinguished mid-arc, directly at the nearest of Vale's two men, plunging half the warehouse into sudden darkness, and buying precisely the moment of confusion he needed to close the distance and put the larger man on the ground with the same efficient, unhurried violence he had once used on a battlefield years before. "Go!" Ellis shouted, already grappling with the second man in the dark. "Both of you, now, while there's still a door to go through." The Duke seized Eleanor's hand and pulled her toward the entrance, weaving between crates in near-total darkness, Vale's furious voice rising somewhere behind them, calling for men Eleanor prayed were not waiting outside as well. They burst through the warehouse door into cold night air, the river black and glittering under a thin moon, and ran the length of the wharf toward the carriage, waiting exactly where they had left it. The driver, already alert to trouble at the sound of shouting, had the horses moving the instant the Duke and Eleanor were inside, the carriage lurching forward into the dark streets, while behind them the warehouse door burst open and Vale's remaining man staggered out, too late, into an empty wharf. "Ellis," Eleanor gasped, once she had caught enough breath to speak at all, "we cannot simply leave him. Ellis has survived considerably worse odds than one drunk dockhand in the dark," the Duke said, though the tightness in his voice betrayed that he was no less worried than she was. "He knows this city better than either of us. He will find his own way to safety, and we will find him again by morning, or I will tear London apart looking." They did find him, in fact, within the hour, waiting calmly at the Duke's own townhouse, with a split lip and a grim satisfaction that suggested the second of Vale's men had come away considerably worse from their brief encounter in the dark. By dawn, the Duke had already sent word to Alderman Whitfield, requesting an audience on a matter of considerable urgency, and by mid-morning, the four of them, Duke, Eleanor, Ellis, and a physician willing to swear to the authenticity of Charlotte's ledger page, sat together in Whitfield's private office, laying out, piece by piece, everything they had gathered. The magistrate was, as the Duke had warned, a cautious man, turning each piece of evidence over with the slow deliberation of someone who understood precisely how much trouble a mistake against a peer of Vale's connections could bring down upon his own career. But caution, Eleanor came to understand watching him work through the morning, was not the same thing as cowardice, and by the time she had finished her own account of Fenwick Street, her voice steady despite everything it cost her to relive it aloud, Whitfield's expression had gone from careful skepticism to something considerably grimmer. "An eyewitness to murder," he said slowly, "a dead clerk's written confession naming the accused directly, a ledger in the victim's own sister's hand, and now a warehouse full of smuggled opium disguised as legitimate cargo. Taken separately, my lady, your grace, any one of these might be argued away by a clever barrister and a well-connected family. Taken together, I do not believe even Parliament itself could shield a man from what you have laid before me this morning." Warrants were issued within the day, quiet ones at first, careful ones, the kind that did not announce themselves with public fanfare, but moved with the deliberate speed of men who understood exactly how easily a wealthy fugitive might vanish, if given even a single night's warning. Vale was taken from his own townhouse 2 mornings later, protesting his innocence in a voice that had lost every trace of its former pleasant confidence, and Harlan Priest, faced with the full weight of evidence against his employer, chose within a week to confess everything in exchange for whatever mercy the courts might show a man who had merely kept the books rather than wielded the knife himself. The trial that followed occupied society's whispers for months afterward, though Eleanor found, once the worst of it had passed, that she cared considerably less than she once might have imagined for what the drawing-rooms of London chose to say about any of it. Her father's debts, once so carefully weaponized against her, mattered little once Vale's fortune was seized to pay restitution to every family his smuggling operation had quietly ruined. Charlotte Kingsley's death, once dismissed as misfortune, was at last properly named for what it truly was, and the Duke, though nothing could return his sister to him, found in the verdict something that at least resembled peace. It was many weeks later, on an evening grown mild with the first true warmth of the coming season, that Eleanor found herself once again standing in a ballroom full of candlelight and music, this time at a modest gathering hosted by friends who had known nothing at all of everything that passed between her and the Duke in the months before. She saw him across the room before he saw her, and something in her chest, which had spent so many weeks braced against fear, finally unclenched entirely at the sight of him. He crossed the floor toward her with the same unhurried certainty she remembered from that first extraordinary night, and this time, when he extended his hand, there was no empty ballroom around them, no cleared floor, no desperate necessity forcing the moment into being. There was only music, and candlelight, and 100 ordinary guests who suspected nothing at all of the danger the two of them had walked through together to arrive at this particular evening. "Lady Ashworth," the Duke said, and there was warmth in his voice now, where once there had only been careful determination. "Might I have this dance?" Eleanor looked at his offered hand for a long moment, remembering every reason she had once had to refuse it, every fear that had once made refusal feel like the only safe answer available to her. None of those reasons remained. Vale was gone, his crimes named and answered for. Her family's fortune stood secure, and the man before her had proven, beyond any doubt an empty ballroom or a warehouse full of danger could raise, that his hand had never once been extended out of anything but genuine regard. "Yes," she said simply, and placed her hand in his. "This time, Your Grace, I choose it freely." The orchestra began to play, and this time no one stopped them, and as the Duke drew her into the first turn of the dance, Eleanor understood at last that some choices, once forced by fear and danger into being tested, become afterward the truest choices a person can make, precisely because nothing remains to compel them except the simple, steady wish to make them at all. They danced until the candles burned low, and when the evening ended at last, it was not with an emptied room or a desperate confession, but with an ordinary walk to an ordinary carriage, and a quiet understanding between them that whatever came next, they would face it exactly as they had faced everything since that first extraordinary night, together and by choice, and without any further need for anyone to clear a room before either of them found the courage to reach for what they wanted.